Four Archetypes by Carl Jung. Spirit. The phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales. One of the unbreakable rules in scientific research is to take an object as known only so far as the inquirer is in the position to make scientifically valid statements about it. Valid, in this sense, simply means what can be verified by facts. The object of inquiry is the natural phenomenon. Now, in psychology, one of the most important phenomena is the statement, and in particular its form and content, the latter aspect being perhaps the more significant with regard to the nature of the psyche. The first task that ordinarily presents itself is the description and arrangement of events. Then comes the closer examination into the laws of their living behavior. To inquire into the substance of what has been observed is possible in natural science only where there is an Archimedean point outside. For the psyche, no such outside standpoint exists. Only the psyche can observe the psyche. Consequently, knowledge of the psyche's substance is impossible for us, at least with the means at present available. This does not rule out the possibility that the atomic physics of the future may supply us with the said Archimedean point. For the time being, however, our subtlest lubrications can establish no more than is expressed in the statement. This is how the psyche behaves. The honest investigator will piously refrain from meddling with questions of substance. I do not think it superfluous to acquaint my reader with the necessary limitations that psychology voluntarily imposes on itself, for she will then be in the position to appreciate the phenomenological standpoint of modern psychology, which is not always understood. This standpoint does not exclude the existence of faith, conviction, and experienced certainties of whatever description, nor does it contest their possible validity. Great as is their importance for the individual and for collective life, psychology completely lacks the means to prove their validity in the scientific sense. One may lament this incapacity on the part of science, but that does not enable it to jump over its own shadow. Concerning the word spirit. The word spirit possesses such a wide range of application that it requires considerable effort to make clear to oneself all the things it can mean. Spirit, we say, is the principle that stands in opposition to matter. By this we understand an immaterial substance or form of existence, which on the highest and most universal level is called God. We imagine this immaterial substance also as the vehicle of psychic phenomena, or even of life itself. In contradiction to this view, there stands the antithesis, spirit and nature. Here the concept of spirit is restricted to the superhuman or anti-natural, and has lost its substantial connection with the psyche and life. A similar restriction is implied in Spinoza's view that spirit is an attribute of the one substance. Hylogogium goes even further, taking spirit to be a quality of matter. A very widespread view conceives spirit as a higher and psyche as a lower principle of activity, and conversely the alchemists thought of spirit as the leganta metum animae et corporis, obviously regarding as spiritus vegetavitas, the latter life spirit or nerve spirit. Equally common is the view that spirit and psyche are essentially the same and can be separated only arbitrarily. One takes spirit as the inner being, regardless of any connection with an outer being. Others restrict spirit to certain psychic capacities or functions or qualities, such as the capacity to think and reason, in contradiction to the more soulful sentiments. Here spirit means the sum total of all the phenomena of rational thought, or of the intellect, including the will, memory, imagination, creative power, and the aspirations motivated by ideas. Spirit has the further connotation of sprightliness, as we might say that a person is spirited, meaning that she is versatile and full of ideas, with a brilliant, witty, and surprising turn of mind. Again, spirit denotes a certain attitude, or the principle underlying it. For example, or for instance, one is educated in the spirit of Pestalozzi, or one says that the spirit of Weimar is the immortal German heritage. A special instance in this time spirit, or spirit of the age, which stands for the principle and motive force behind certain views, judgments, and axioms of a collective nature. Then there is the objective spirit, by which is meant the whole stock of man's cultural possessions with particular regard to his intellectual and religious achievements. As linguistic usage shows, spirit is the sense of an attitude in the sense of an attitude has unmistakable leanings towards personification. The spirit of Pestalozzi can also be taken consecretially as his ghost or imago, just as the spirit of Weimar are the personal spectres of Goethe and Schiller. For spirit has the spookish meaning of the soul of one departed. The cold breath of the spirits points on the one hand to the ancient affinity of Xyxi with Fuxios and Fuxos, Fuxros and Fuxos, which both mean cold. On the other hand, to the original meaning of pneuma, which simply denoted air and motion, and in the same way animus and anima are connected with animos, or wind. The German word Geist probably has more to do with something frothing, effervescing, or fermenting, hence affinities with Geist, foam, Gast, geese, and ghost, and also with the emotional ghastly and august are not to be rejected. From time immemorial, emotion has been regarded as possession, which is why we still say today of a hot-tempered person that he is possessed of the devil, or even an evil spirit has entered into him. Just as, according to the old view, spirits or souls of the dead are of a subtle disposition like a vapor or a smoke, so the alchemist spiritus was the subtle, volatile, active, and vivifying essence, such as alcohol was understood to be, and all the arcane substances. On this level, spirit includes spirits of salts, spirits of ammonia, formic acid, etc. This score or so of meanings and shades of meanings attributable to the word spirit makes it difficult for the psychologist to delineate her subject conceptually, but on the other hand they lighten the task of describing it, since the many different aspects go to form a vivid and concrete picture of the phenomenon in question. We are concerned with a functional complex, which originally on the primitive level was felt as an invisible, breath-like presence. William James has given us a lively account of his primordial phenomenon in the varieties of religious experience. In his Varieties of a Religious Experience, a book. Another well-known example is the wind of the Pentecostal miracle. The primitive mentality finds it quite natural to personify the invisible presence of a ghost or a demon. The souls or spirits of the dead are identical with the psyche, living actively with the psychic activity of the living. They are merely continuing it. The view that the psyche is a spirit is implicit in this. When therefore something psychic happens in the individual which he feels as belonging to, or she feels as belonging to herself, then something is her own spirit. But if anything psychic happens which seems strange to her, then it is somebody else's spirit, and it may be causing a possession. The spirit in the first case corresponds to the subjective attitude. In the latter case to public opinion, to the time spirit, or to the original, not yet human, anthropoid disposition, which we also call the unconscious. In keeping with its original wind nature, spirit is always an active, winged, and swift-moving being, as well as that which vivifies, stimulates, incites, fires, and inspires. To put it in modern language, spirit is the dynamic principle, forming for that very reason the classical antithesis of matter, the antithesis, that is, of its stasis and inertia. Basically, it is the contrast between life and death. The subsequent differentiation of this contrast leads to the actually very remarkable opposition of spirit and nature. Even though spirit is regarded as essentially alive and enlivening, one cannot really feel nature as unspiritual and dead. We must therefore be dealing here with the Christian postulate of a spirit whose life is so vastly superior to the life of nature, that in comparison with it, the latter is no better than death. This special development in man's idea of spirit rests on the recognition that its invisible presence in a psyche is a psyche phenomenon, i.e. one's own spirit, and that this consists not only of you precious of life, but of formal products too. Among the first, the most prominent are the images and shadowy presentations that occupy our inner fields of vision. Among the second, thinking and reason, which organize the world of images. In this way, a transcendent spirit superimposed itself upon the original natural life spirit, and even swang over to the opposite position, as though the latter were merely naturalistic. The transcendent spirit becomes the supernatural and transmundane cosmic principle of order, and as such was given the name of God, or at least it became an attribute of the one substance, as in Spinoza, or one person of the Godhead, as in Christianity. The corresponding development of spirit is in the reverse, hylozoistic direction, a maiori ad minus, took place under anti-Christian auspices and materialism. The premise underlying this reaction is the exclusive certainty of the spirit's identity with psychic functions, whose dependence upon brain and metabolism became increasingly clear. One had only to give the one substance another name and call it matter to produce the idea of a spirit which was entirely dependent on nutrition and environment, and whose highest form was the intellect or reason. This meant that the original pneumatic presence had taken its abode in man's psychology, and a writer like Klages could arraign the spirit as an adversity of the soul. For it was into this latter concept that the original spontaneity of the spirit withdrew after it had been degraded to a servile attribute of matter. Somewhere or other the deus ex machina quality of spirit had to be preserved. If not in the spirit itself, then in its synonym, the soul, that glancing aeolian thing, elusive as a butterfly, anima, fuxe. Even though the materialistic conception of the spirit did not prevail everywhere, it still persisted outside the sphere of religion in the realm of conscious phenomena. Spirit, as subjective spirit, came to mean a purely endopsychic phenomenon, while objective spirit did not mean the universal spirit, or God, but merely the sum total of intellectual and cultural possessions which make up our human institutions and the content of our libraries. Spirit had fortified its original nature, its autonomy and spontaneity over a very wide area, with the solitary exception of the religious field, where, at least in principle, its pristine character remained unimpaired. In this resume, we have described an entity which presents itself to us as an immediate psychic phenomenon distinguished from other psychisms whose existence is naively believed to be causally dependent upon physical influence. A connection between spirit and physical conditions is not immediately apparent, and for this reason it was credited with immateriality to a much higher degree than was the case with psychic phenomenon in the narrower sense. Now, not only is a certain physical dependence attributed to the latter, but they are themselves thought of as possessing a kind of materiality, as the idea of the subtle body and the Chinese Q soul clearly show. In view of the intimate connection that exists between certain psychic processes and their physical parallels, we cannot very well accept the total immateriality of the psyche. Again, the consensus omnium insists on the immateriality of spirit, though not everyone would agree that it also has a reality of its own. It is, however, not easy to see why our hypothetical matter, which looks quite different from what it did even 30 years ago, alone should be real, and spirit not. Although the idea of immateriality does not in itself exclude that of reality, popular opinion invariably associates reality with materiality. Spirit and matter may well be forms of one and the same transcendental being. For instance, the Tantrists, with as much right, say that matter is nothing other than the concreteness of God's thoughts. The sole immediate reality is the psychic reality of conscious contents, which are, as it were, labeled with spiritual or material origin, as the case may be. The hallmarks of spirit are, firstly, the principle of spontaneous movement and activity. Secondly, the spontaneous capacity to produce images independent of sense perception. And thirdly, the autonomous and sovereign manipulation of those images. This spiritual entity approaches primitive man from the outside, but with increasing development it gets lodged in man's consciousness and becomes a subordinate function, thus apparently forfeiting its original character of autonomy. That character is now retained only in the most conservative views, namely in the religious. The descent of spirit into the sphere of human consciousness is expressed in the myth of the divine Veos, caught in the embrace of Fuxis. This process, continuing over the ages, is probably an unavoidable necessity, and the religious would find themselves in a very forlorn situation if they believed in the attempt to hold up evolution. Their task, if they are well advised, is not to impede the inelucidable march of events, but to guide it in such a way that it can proceed without fatal injury to the soul. The religions should therefore constantly recall to us the origin and original character of the spirit, lest man should forget what she is drawing into herself and with what she is filling her consciousness. She herself did not create the spirit, but rather the spirit makes her creative, always spurring her on, giving her lucky ideas, staying power, enthusiasm, and inspiration. So much indeed does it permeate her whole being that she is in gravest danger of thinking that she can actually create the spirit and that she has it. In reality, however, the primordial phenomena of the spirit takes possession of her, while appearing to be the willing object of human intentions. It binds her freedom, just as the physical world does, with 1,000 chains, and becomes an obsessive idée force. Spirit threatens the naive-minded man with inflammation, of which our own times has given us the most horribly instructive examples. The danger becomes all the greater the more our interest fastens upon external objects, and the more we forget that the differentiation of our relationship to nature should go hand in hand with a correspondingly differentiated relation to the spirit, so as to establish the necessary balance. If the outer object is not offset by the inner, unbridled materialism results, coupled with maniacal arrogance, or else the extinction of the autonomous personality, which is, in any case, the ideal of a totalitarian mass state. As can be seen readily, the common modern idea of spirit ill accords with the Christian view, which regards it as sunam bonum, as God himself. To be sure, there is also the idea of an evil spirit, but the modern idea cannot be equated with that either, since for us spirit is not necessarily evil. We would have to call it morally indifferent or neutral. When the Bible says God is spirit, It sounds more like the definition of a substance or like a qualification. But the devil, too, it seems, is endowed with the same peculiar spiritual substance, albeit an evil and corrupt one. The original identity of substance is still expressed in the idea of the fallen angel, as well as the close connection between Jehovah and Satan in the Old Testament. There may be an echo of this primitive connection in the Lord's Prayer, where we say, "Lead us not into temptation." For is not this really the business of the tempter, the devil himself? This brings us to a point we have not considered at all in the course of our observations so far. We have availed ourselves of cultural and everyday conceptions, which are the product of human consciousness, and its reflections, in order to form a picture of the psychic modes of manifestation of the factor of spirit. But we have yet to consider that because of its original autonomy, about which there can be no doubt, in the psychological sense, the spirit is quite capable of staging its own manifestations spontaneously. 2. Self-representation of the spirit in dreams. The psychic manifestations of the spirit indicate at once that they are of an archetypal nature. In other words, the phenomenon we call spirit descends on the existence of an autonomous primordial image which is universally present in the pre-conscious makeup of human psyche. As usual, I first came up against this problem when investigating the dreams of my patients. It struck me that a certain kind of father complex has a spiritual character, so to speak, in the sense that the father image gives rise to statements, actions, tendencies, impulses, opinions, etc., to which one could hardly deny the attributes spiritual. In men, a positive father complex very often produces a certain credulity with regard to authority and a distant willingness to bow down before all spiritual dogmas and values, while in women it induces the liveliest spiritual aspirations and interests. In dreams, it is always the father figure from whom the decisive convictions, prohibitions, and wise counsels emanate. The invisibility of this source is frequently emphasized by the fact that it consists simply of an authoritative voice which passes final judgments. Mostly, therefore, it is the figure of a wise old man who symbolizes the spiritual factor. Sometimes the part is played by the real spirit, namely the ghost of one dead, or more rarely by grotesque gnome-like figures or talking animals. The dwarf forms are found, at least in my experience, mainly in women. Hence it seems to me logical that in Ernst Barlach's play Der Todstag, the gnome-like figure of Steisbard, Rumpbeard, is associated with the mother, just as Bess is associated with the mother goddess at Karnak. In both sexes, the spirit can also take the form of a boy or a youth. In women, he corresponds to the so-called positive animus, who indicates the possibility of conscious spiritual effort. In men, his meaning is not so simple. He can be positive, in which case he signifies the higher personality, the self or filius regius, as conceived by the alchemist. But he can also be negative, and then he signifies the infantile shadow. In both cases, the boy means some form of spirit. Greybeard and boy belong together. The pair of them play a considerable role in alchemy as symbols of Mercurius. It can never be established with 100% certainty whether the spirit figures in dreams are morally good. Very often they show all signs of duplicity, if not of outright malice. I must emphasize, however, that the grand plan on which the unconscious life of the psyche is constructed is so inaccessible to our understanding that we can never know what evil may not be necessary in order to produce good by antiodromia, and what good may very possibly lead to evil. Sometimes the probate spiritus recommended by John cannot, with the best will of the world, be anything other than a cautious and patient waiting to see how things will finally turn out. The figure of the wise old man can appear so plastically, not only in dreams, but also in visionary meditation, or what we call active imagination, that it is sometimes apparently the case the case in India, it takes over as the role of guru. The wise old man appears in dreams in the guise of a magician, a doctor, a priest, teacher, professor, grandfather, or any other person possessing authority. The archetype of spirit, in the shape of man, hobgoblin, or animal, always appears in a situation where insight, understanding, good advice, determination, planning, etc. are needed, but cannot be mustered on one's own resources. The archetype compensates this state of spiritual deficiency by contents designed to fill the gap. An excellent example of this is the dream about white and black magicians, which tried to compensate the spiritual difficulties of a young theological student. I did not know the dreamer myself, so the question of my personal influence is ruled out. He dreamed. He was standing in the presence of a sublime hierarchic figure called the White Magician, who is nevertheless clothed in a long black robe. This magician had just ended a lengthy discourse when the words, "And for what we require the help, and for that we require the help of the black magician." Then the door suddenly opened and another old man came out, the black magician, who, however, was dressed in a white robe. He too looked noble and sublime. The black musician evidently wanted to speak with the white, but hesitated to do so in the presence of the dreamer. And at that the white magician, pointing to the dreamer, said, "Speak! He is an innocent." So the black magician began to relate a strange story of how he had found the lost keys of paradise and did not know how to use them. He said he had come to the white magician for an explanation of the secret of the keys. He told him that the king of the country in which he lived was seeking a suitable tomb for himself. His subject, had chanced to dig up the old sarcophagus containing the mortal remains of a virgin. The king opened the sarcophagus, threw away the bones, and had the empty sarcophagus buried again for later use. But no sooner had the bones seen the light of day than the being to whom they had once belonged, the virgin, changed into a black horse that galloped off into the desert. The black musician pursued it across the sandy wastes and beyond, and thereafter many vicissitudes and difficulties he found the lost keys of paradise. That was the end of his story, and also unfortunately of the dream. Here the compensation certainly did not fall out as the dreamer would wish, by handing him a solution on a plate. Rather, it confronted him with a problem to which I have already alluded, and one which life is always bringing up against, namely, the uncertainty of all moral valuation, the bewildering interplay of good and evil, and the remorseless concatenation of guilt, suffering, and redemption. This path to the primordial religious experience is the right one, but how can one recognize it? It is like a small, still voice, and it sounds from afar. It is ambiguous, questionable, dark, a presager of danger and hazardous adventures, a razor-edged path to be trodden for God's sake only, without assurance and without sanction. Three, the spirit in fairy tales. And here Mark says, I am indebted to Mrs. M. von Roques and Dr. Marie-Louise von Franz for the fairy tale materials used here. I would gladly present the reader with some more modern dream material, but I fear that the individuation of dreams would make too high a demand upon our exposition and would claim more space than is here at our disposal. We shall therefore return to folklore, where we need not get involved in the grim confrontations and entanglements of individual case histories, and can observe the variations of the spirit motif without having to consider conditions that are more or less unique. In myths and fairy tales, as in dreams, the psyche tells its own story, and the interplay of the archetypes is revealed in its natural setting as formation, transformation, the eternal mind's eternal recreation. The frequency with which spirit type appears as an old man is about the same in fairy tales as in dreams. The old man always appears when the hero is in a hopeless and desperate situation from which only profound reflection or a lucky idea, in other words, a spiritual function, or an endo-psychic autonomism of sort, can extricate him. For instance, for internal and external reasons, the hero cannot accomplish this himself, and knowledge needed to compensate the deficiency comes in the form of a personified thought, i.e., in the shape of this sagacious and helpful old man. An Estonian fairy tale, for instance, tells of how an ill-treated little orphan boy who had let a cow escape was afraid to return home again for fear of more punishment. So he ran away, chancing to luck. He naturally got himself into a hopeless situation with no visible way out. Exhausted, he fell into a deep sleep. When he awoke, it seemed to him that he had something liquid in his mouth, and he saw a little old man with a long gray beard standing before him, who was in the act of replacing a stopper in his little milk flask. "Give me some more to drink," begged the boy. "You have had enough for today," replied the old man. "If my path had not chanced to lead me to you, that would assuredly have been your last sleep, for when I found you, you were half dead." Then the old man asked the boy who he was and where he wanted to go. The boy recounted everything he could remember happening to him up to the beating he had received in the previous evening. "My dear child," said the old man, "you are no better and no worse off than many others whose dear protectors and comforters rest in their coffins under the earth. You can no longer turn back. Now that you have run away, you must seek a new fortune in the world. And I have neither house nor home, nor wife nor child. I cannot take further care of you, but I will give you some good advice for nothing." So far the old man has been expressing no more than what the boy, the hero of the tale, could have thought out for himself. Having given way to the stress of emotion and simply run off like that into the blue, he would at least have had time to reflect that he needed food. It would also have been necessary at such a moment to consider his position. The whole story of his life up to the recent past would then have passed before his mind, as is usual in such a case. An anamnesis of this kind is a purposeful process whose aim is to gather the assets of the whole personality together at that critical moment when all one's spiritual and physical forces are challenged, and with this united strength to fling open the doors to the future. No one can help the boy to do this. He has to rely entirely on himself. There's no going back. This realization will give the necessary resolution to his actions. By forcing him to face the issue, the old man saves him the trouble of making up his mind. Indeed, the old man is himself this purposeful reflection and concentration of moral and physical forces that comes about spontaneously in the psychic space outside consciousness when conscious thought is not yet or no longer possible. The concentration and tension of psychic forces have something about them that always looks like magic. They develop an unexplained power of endurance, which is often superior to the conscious effort of will. One can observe this experientially in the artificial concentration induced by hypnosis. In my demonstrations, I used regularly to put an hysteric, a weak bodily build, into a deep hypnotic sleep, and then get her to lie with the back of her head on the chair, and her heels resting on one chair and her heels resting on the other, stiff as a board, and leave her there for about a minute. Her pulse would gradually go up to 90. A husky young athlete among the students tried in vain to imitate this feat in a conscious effort of will. He collapsed in the middle with his pulse racing at 120. When the clever old man had brought the boy to this point, he could begin his good advice, i.e., the situation no longer looked hopeless. He advised him to continue his wanderings, always to the eastward, where after 7 years he would reach the great mountain that that betoken his good fortune. The bigness and tallness of the mountain are allusions to his adult personality. Concentration of his powers brings assurance and is therefore the best guarantee of success. From now on, he will lack for nothing. Take my script and my flask, says the old man, and each day you will find in them all the food and drink you need. At the same time, he gave him a burdock leaf that could change into a boat whenever the boy had to cross the water. Often the old man in fairy tales asks the questions like who, why, whence, and whither, for the purpose of inducing self-reflection and mobilizing the moral forces, and more often still he gives the necessary magical talisman, the unexpected and improbable power to succeed, which is one of the particularities of the unified personality in good and bad alike. But the intervention of the old man, the spontaneous objectification of the archetype, would seem to be equally indispensable, since the conscious will by itself is hardly ever capable of uniting the personality to the point where it acquires this extraordinary power to succeed. For this, not only in fairy tales, but in life generally, the objective intervention of the archetype is needed, which checks the purely affective reactions with a chain of inner confrontations and realizations. These cause the who, where, how, why to emerge clearly in this wise bring knowledge of the immediate situation as well as the goal. The resultant enlightenment and unifying of the fatal tangle often has something positively magical about it, an experience not unknown to the psychotherapist. The tendency of the old man to set one thinking also takes the form of urging people to sleep on it. Thus he says to the girl who is searching for her lost brother, "Lie down, morning is cleverer than evening." He also sees through the gloomy situation of the hero, who has got himself into trouble, or at least can give him such information as will help him on his journey. To this end, he makes ready use of animals, particularly birds. To the prince, who has gone in search of the kingdom of heaven, the old hermit says, "I have lived here for 300 years, and yet never has anybody asked me about the kingdom of heaven. I cannot tell you myself, but up there, on another floor in the house, live all kinds of birds, and they surely can tell you." The old man knows that roads leads to the goal and points them out to the hero. He warns of dangers to come and supplies the means of meeting them effectively. For instance, he tells the boy who has gone to fetch the silver water that the well is guarded by a lion who has a deceptive trick of sleeping with his eyes open and watching with his eyes shut. Or he counsels the youth who is riding to a magic fountain in order to fetch the healing drop for a king, only to draw the water at a trot because the lurking witches who lasso everything that come from the fountain. He charges the princess whose lover has been changed into a werewolf to make a fire and put a cauldron of tar over it. Then she must plunge her beloved white lily into the boiling tar, and when the werewolf comes, she must empty the cauldron over its head, which will release her lover from the spell. Occasionally the old man is a very critical old man, as in the Caucasian tale of the youngest prince who wanted to build a flawless church for his father, so as to inherit the kingdom. This he does, and nobody can discover a single flaw, but then an old man comes along and says, "That's a fine church you've built, to be sure. What a pity the main wall is a bit crooked." The prince has the church pulled down again and built a new one. But here too the old man discovers a flaw, and so on for the third time. The old man thus represents knowledge, reflection, insight, wisdom, cleverness, and intuition on the one hand, and on the other, moral qualities such as goodwill and readiness to help, which make his spiritual character sufficiently plain. Since the archetype is an autonomous content of the unconscious, the fairy tale, which usually concretizes the archetypes, can cause the old man to appear in a dream, in much the same way as happens in modern dreams. In a Balkan tale, the old man appears to a hard-pressed hero in a dream and gives him good advice about accompanying the impossible tasks that have been imposed upon him. His relation to the unconscious is clearly expressed in one Russian fairy tale, where he is called the king of the forest. As the peasant sat up wearily on a tree stump, A little old man crept up. All wrinkled he was, and a green beard hung down to his knees. "Who are you?" asked the peasant. "I am Och, king of the forest," said the manikin. The peasant hired out his most profligate son to him, and the king of the forest departed with the young man and conducted him to the other world, under the earth, and brought him to a green hut. In the hut everything was green. The walls were green, and the benches, and Och's wife was green, and the children were green, and the little water woman who waited on him was green as rue. Even the food was green. The king of the forest is here a vegetarian, or a tree newman, who reigns in the woods, and through the nixies also has connections with water, which clearly show his relation to the unconscious, since the latter is frequently expressed through wood and water symbols. There is equally a connection with the unconscious when the old man appears as a dwarf. The fairy tale about the princess who was searching for her lover says, "Night came, and the darkness, and still the princess sat in the same place and wept. As she sat there lost in thought, she heard a voice greeting her. 'Good evening, pretty maid. Why are you sitting there so lonely and sad?' She sprung up hastily, and felt very confused, and with no wonder. For when she looked round there was only a tiny little man standing before her, who nodded his head at her and looked so kind and simple. It is a Swiss fairy tale. The peasant's son, who wants to bring the king's daughter a basket of apple, encourages Es chilis igis, mandli das forget nie, was do dem kratchi hag, a little iron man who asked what he has there in the basket. In another passage, the mandli has es ingis chalaidri iron clothes on. By isig, presumably, eastern iron is meant, which is more probable than eislig, icy. In the latter case, it would be es chalaidi vos is, clothes of ice. There are indeed little icemen and little metal men too. In fact, in a modern dream I have even come across a little black iron man who appeared at a critical juncture, like one of the fairy tales of the country bumpkin who wanted to marry the princess. In the modern series of visions, in which the figures of the wise old men occurred several times, he was on one occasion of normal size and appeared at the very bottom of a crater surrounded by high rocky walls. On another occasion he was a tiny figure on top of a mountain, inside a low stony enclosure. We find the same motif in Goethe's tale of the dwarf princess who lived in a casket. In this connection we might also mention the Anthroparion, the little leaden man of the Zosimos vision, as well as the metallic men who dwell in the mines, the crafty dactyls of antiquity, the homunculi of the alchemists, and the gnomic throng of hobgoblins, brownies, gremlins, etc. How real such conceptions are clear to me on the occasion of serious mountaineering accident. After the catastrophe, too, the climbers had a collective vision, in broad daylight, of a little hooded man who scrambled out of an inaccessible crevasse in the ice face and passed across the great glacier, creating a regular panic in the two beholders. I have often encountered motifs which made me think that the unconscious must be the world of an infinitesimally small. Such an idea could be derived rationalistically from the obscure feeling that in all the visions we are dealing with something endopsychic, the inference being that a thing must be exceedingly small in order to fit inside the head. I am no such friend of any such rational conjectures, though I would not say that they are all beside the mark. It seems to me more probable that this liking for diminutives on the one hand, and for superlatives, giants, etc., on the other hand, is connected with the queer uncertainty of spatial and temporal relations in the unconscious. Man's sense of proportion, his rational conception of big and small, is distinctly anthropomorphic, and it loses its validity not only in the realm of psychic phenomena, but also in those parts of the collective unconscious beyond the range of the specifically human. The ant-man is smaller than small and bigger than big. He is the size of a thumb, yet he encompasses the earth on every side and rules over the 10-finger space. As is the Kabiri Gothi says, little in length, mighty in strength. In the same way, the archetype of the wise old man is quite tiny, almost imperceptible, and yet it possesses a fateful potency, as anyone can see when he gets down to fundamentals. The archetypes have this peculiarity in common with the atomic world, which is demonstrating before our eyes that the more deeply the investigator penetrates into the universe of microphysics, the more devastating are the explosive forces he finds enchained there. That the greatest efforts could come from the smallest causes has become patently clear, not only in physics, but in the field of psychological research as well. How often in the critical moments of life everything hangs on what appears to be a mere nothing. In certain primitive fairy tales, the illuminating quality of our archetype is expressed by the fact that the old man is identified with the sun. He brings a firebrand with him which he uses for roasting a pumpkin. After he has eaten, he takes the fire away again, which causes mankind to steal it from him. In a North American Indian tale, the old man is a witch doctor who owns the fire. Spirit, too, has a fiery aspect, as we know from the language of the Old Testament and from the story of the Pentecostal miracle. Apart from his cleverness, wisdom, and insight, the old man, as we have already mentioned, is also notable for his moral qualities. What is more, he even tests the moral qualities of others, and makes his gift dependent upon this test. There is a particularly instructive example of this in the Estonian fairy tale of the stepdaughter and the real daughter. The former is an orphan distinguished for her obedience and good behavior. The story begins with her distaff falling into a well. She jumps in after it, but does not drown, and comes to a magic country where, continuing her quest, she meets a cow, a ram, and an apple tree, whose wishes she fulfills. She now comes to a wash-house, where a dirty old man is sitting, who wants her to wash him. The following dialogue develops. Pretty maid, wash me, do, for it is hard for me to be so dirty. What shall I heat the stove with? Collect wood pegs and crow's dung, and make a fire with that. But she fetches sticks, and asks, where shall I get the bath water? Under the barn there stands a white mare. Get her to piss into the tub. But she takes clean water, and asks, where shall I get a bath switch? Cut off the mare's tail, and make a bath switch of that. But she makes one out of birch twigs, and says, where shall I get soap? Take a pumice-stone and scrub me with that. But she fetches soap from the village, and with that she washes the old man. As a reward, he gives her a bag full of gold and precious stones. The daughter of the house naturally becomes jealous, throws her distaff into the well, where she finds it again instantly. And nevertheless she goes on, and does everything wrong that the stepdaughter had done right, and is rewarded accordingly. The frequency of this motif makes further examples superfluous. The figure of the superior and helpful old man tempts one to connect him somehow or other with God. In the German tale of the soldier and the black princess, it is related how the princess, on whom a curse has been laid, creeps out of her iron coffin every night and devours the soldier standing guard over the tomb. One soldier, when his turn came, tried to escape. That evening he stole away, fled over the fields and mountains, and came to a beautiful meadow. Suddenly a little man stood before him with a long gray beard, but it was none other than the Lord God himself, who could no longer go on looking at all the mischief the devil wrought every night. Whither away? Said the little gray man. May I come with you? And because the little man looked so friendly, the soldier told him that he had run away and why he had done so. Good advice follows, as always. In this story, the old man is mistaken for God in the same naive way that the English alchemist Sir George Ripley describes the old king, Vantiquus Diram, the Ancient of Days. Just as all archetypes have a positive, favorable, bright side and points upwards, so also they have one that points downwards, partly negative and unfavorable, partly chthonic, but for the rest merely neutral. To this the spirit archetype is no exception. Even his dwarf form implies a kind of limitation and suggests a naturalistic vegetation new and sprung from the underworld. In one Balkan tale, the old man is handicapped by the loss of an eye. It has been gouged out by the Vili, a species of winged demon, and the hero is charged with the task of getting them to restore it to him. The old man has therefore lost part of his eyesight, that is, his insight and enlightenment, to the demonic world of darkness. This handicap is reminiscent of the fate of Osiris, who lost an eye to the sight of the black pig, his wicked brother Set, or again of Wotan, who sacrificed his eye at the spring of Mimir. Characteristically enough, an animal ridden by the old man in our fairy tale is a goat, a sign that he himself has a dark side. In the Siberian tale he appears as a one-legged, one-handed, one-eyed greybeard who wakens a dead man with an iron staff. In the course of the story, the latter, after being brought back to life several times, kills the old man by mistake and thus throws away his good fortune. The story is entitled The One-Sided Old Man, and in truth his handicap shows that he consists of only one half. The other half is invisible, but appears in the shape of a murderer who seeks the hero's life. Eventually, the hero succeeds in killing his persistent murderer, but in the struggle he also kills the one-sided old man, so that the identity of the two victims is clearly revealed. It is thus possible that the old man is his own opposite, a life-bringer as well as a death-dealer, ad utrucum peritus, skilled in both, as is said of Hermes. In these circumstances, whenever the simple and kindly old man appears, it is advisable, for heuristic and other reasons, to scrutinize the context and with some care. For instance, in the Estonian tale we first mentioned, when the hired boy who lost the cow, there is a suspicion that the helpful old man who happened to be on the spot so opportunely also surreptitiously made away with the cow beforehand in order to give his protege an excellent reason for taking to flight. This may well be, for everyday experience shows that it is quite possible for a superior, though subliminal, foreknowledge of fate to contrive some annoying incidents for the sole purpose of bullying our simple Simon, of an ego-consciousness, into the way he should go, which for sheer stupidity he would never have found himself. Had our orphan guessed that it was the old man who had whisked up his cow as if by magic, he would have seemed like a spiteful troll or a devil. And indeed the old man has a wicked aspect too, just as the primitive medicine man is a healer and a helper, and also a dreaded concoctor of poisons. The very word pharmaxon means poison, as well as antidote, and poison can in fact be both. The old man, then, has an ambiguous elfin character. Witness the extremely instructive figure of Merlin, seeming in certain of his forms to be a good incarnate and in other aspects of evil. Then again, he is the wicked magician who, from sheer egoism, does evil for evil's sake. In a Siberian folk tale, he is an evil spirit on whose head were 2 lakes, with 2 ducks swimming in them. He feeds on human flesh. The story relates how the hero and his companions go to the feast in the next village, leaving their dogs at home. These, acting on the principle, when the cat's away the mice do play, also arrange a feast, at the climax of which they all hurl themselves on the stores of meat. The men return home and chase out the dogs, who dash off into the wilderness. Then the creator spoke to Amenquet, the hero of the tale. Go and look for the dogs with your wife. But he gets caught in a terrible snowstorm and has to seek shelter in the hut of an evil spirit. There now follows the well-known motif of the bitter bit. The creator is Amenquet's father, but the father of the creator is called the self-created because he created himself. Although we are nowhere told that the old man with the 2 lakes in his head lured the hero and his wife into the hut in order to satisfy his hunger, it may be conjectured that a very peculiar spirit must have got into the dogs to cause them to celebrate a feast like the men, and afterwards, contrary to the nature, to run away, so that Amenquet's wards, contrary to the nature, so that Amenquet had to go out and look for them. And then the hero was then caught in the snowstorm in order to drive him into the arms of the wicked old man. The fact that the creator, son of the self-created, was a party to the advice raises a knotty problem, whose solution we had best leave to the Siberian theologians. In the Baltic fairy tale, the old man gives the childless Tsarina a magic apple to eat, from which she becomes pregnant and bears a son, it being stipulated that the old man shall be his godfather. The boy, however, grows up into a horrid little tough who bullies all the children and slaughters the cattle. For 10 years he is given no name. Then the old king appears, sticks a knife in his leg, and calls him Knife Prince. The boy now wants to set forth on his own adventures, which his father, after long hesitation, finally allows him to do. The knife in his leg is of vital importance. If he draws it out himself, he will live. If anybody else does so, he will die. In the end, the knife becomes his doom, for an old witch pulls it out when he's asleep. He dies, but is restored to life by the friends he has won. Here the old man is a helper, but also the contriver of a dangerous fate, which might just as easily have turned out for the bad. The evil shows itself early and plainly in the boy's villainous character. In another Balkan tale, there is a variant of our motif that is worth mentioning. A king is looking for his sister, who has been abducted by a stranger. His wanderings bring him to the hut of an old woman who warns him against continuing the search. But a tree laden with fruit, ever receding before him, lures him away from the hut. When at last the tree comes to a halt, an old man climbs down from the branches. He regales the king and takes him to the castle, where the sister is living with the old man as his wife. She tells her brother the old man is a wicked spirit who will kill him, and sure enough, 3 days afterwards, the king vanishes without a trace. His younger brother now takes up the search and kills the wicked spirit in the form of a dragon. A handsome young man is thereby released from the spell and forthwith marries the sister. The old man, appearing at first as a tree Newman, is obviously connected with the sister. He is a murderer, and in an interlopated episode he is accused of enchanting a whole city by turning it to iron, i.e. making it immovable, rigid, and locked up. He also holds the king's sister a captive, and will not let her return to her relatives. This amounts to saying that the sister is animus possessed. The old man is therefore to be regarded as her animus, but the manner in which the king is drawn into this possession, and the way he seeks for his sister, makes us think that she has an anima significance for her brother. The fateful archetype of the old man has accordingly first taken possession of the king's anima, in other words, robbed him of the archetype of life, which the anima personifies, and forced him to go in search of the lost charm, the treasure hard to attain, thus making him the mythical hero, the higher personality who is an expression of the self. Meanwhile, the old man acts the part of the villain, and has to be forcibly removed, only to appear at the end as the husband of the sister anima, or more properly, as the bridegroom of the soul, who celebrates the sacred incest that symbolizes the union of opposites and equals. This bold enantiodromia, a very common occurrence, not only signifies the rejuvenation and transformation of the old man, but hints at secret inner relation of good to evil and vice versa. So in this story we see the archetype of the old man in the guise of the evildoer, caught in all the twists and turns of an individuation process that ends suggestively with the hieros gamos. Conversely, in the Russian tale of the Forest King, he starts by being helpful and benevolent, but then refuses to let his hired boy go, so that the main episode in the story deals with the boy's repeated attempts to escape from the clutches of the magician. Instead of the quest, we have flight, which nonetheless appears to win the same reward as adventures valiantly sought, for in the end the hero marries the king's daughter. The magician, however, must rest content with the role of the bitter bit. 4. Theomorphic spirit symbol in fairy tales. The description of our archetype would not be complete if we omitted to consider one special form of its manifestation, namely its animal form. This belongs essentially to the theomorphism of gods and demons, as has the same psychological significance, and has the same psychological significance. The animal forms show that the contents and functions in question are still in the extra-human sphere, i.e., on a plane beyond human consciousness, and consequently have a share, on the one hand, in a demonically superhuman, and on the other hand, in the bestial, the subhuman. It must be remembered, however, that this division is only true within the sphere of the conscious, which is a necessary condition of thought. Logic says terratium non datur, meaning that we cannot envisage the opposites in their oneness. In other words, while the abolition of an obstinate antinomy can be no more than a postulate for us, this is by no means so for the unconscious, whose contents are without exception paradoxical or antinomial by nature, not excluding the category of being. If anyone unacquainted with the psychology of the unconscious wants to get a working knowledge of these matters, I would recommend a study of Christian mysticism and Indian philosophy, where she will find the clearest elaborations of the antinomies of the unconscious. Although the old man has, up to now, looked and behaved more or less like a human being, his magical powers and his spiritual superiority suggest that, in good and bad alike, he is outside or above or below the human level. Neither for the primitive nor for the unconscious does his animal aspect imply any devaluation, for in certain respects the animal is superior to man. It has not yet blundered into the consciousness, nor pitted a self-willed ego against the power from which it lives. On the contrary, it fulfills the will that actuates it in a well-nigh perfect manner. Were it conscious, it would be morally better than man. There is a deep doctrine in the legend of the fall. It is the expression of dim presentiment that the emancipication of ego consciousness was a Luciferian deed. Man's whole history consists from the very beginning in a conflict between his feelings of inferiority and his arrogance. Wisdom seeks the middle path and pays for this audacity by a dubious affinity with the daimon and the beast, and so is open to moral misinterpretation. Again and again in fairy tales we encounter the motif of helpful animals. These act like humans, speak a human language, and display a sagacity and a knowledge superior to man's. In these circumstances, we can say with some justification that the archetype of the spirit is being expressed through an animal form. A German fairy tale relates how a young man, while searching for his lost princess, meets a wolf, who says, Do not be afraid, but tell me, where is your way leading to? The young man recounts his story, whereupon the wolf gives him as a magic gift a few of his hairs, with which the young man can summon his help at any time. This intermezzo proceeds exactly like the meeting with the helpful old man. In the same story, the archetype also displays its other wicked side. In order to make this clear, I shall give the summary of the story. While the young man is watching his pigs in the woods, he discovers a large tree, whose branches lose themselves in the clouds. How would it be, he says to himself, if you were to look at the world from the top of that great tree? So he climbs up, all day long he climbs, without even reaching the branches. Evening comes, and he has to pass the night in the fork of the tree. Next day he goes on climbing, and by noon he has reached the foliage. Only towards the evening does he come to a village nestled in the branches. The peasants who live there give him food and shelter for the night. In the morning he climbs still further. At noon he reaches a castle in which a young girl lives. Here he finds the tree goes no further. She is a king's daughter, held prisoner by a wicked magician. So the young man stays with the princess, and she allows him to go to all the rooms of the castle. In one room alone she forbids him to enter. But curiosity is too strong. He unlocks the door, and there in the room he finds a raven fixed to the wall with 3 nails. 1 nail goes through his throat, 2 others through the wings. The raven complains of thirst, and the young man, moved by pity, gives him water to drink. At each sip a nail falls out, and in the third sip the raven is free and flies out the window. When the princess hears of it, she is very frightened and says, "That was the devil who enchanted me. It won't be long now before he fetches me again." And one fine morning she has indeed vanished. The young man now sets out in search of her, and as we have described above, meets the wolf. In the same way he meets a bear and a lion, who also give him hairs. In addition, the lion informs him that the princess is imprisoned nearby in a hunting lodge. The young man finds the house and the princess, but is told that flight is impossible because the hunter possesses a three-legged white horse that knows everything and would infallibly warn its master. Despite that, the young man tries to flee with her, but in vain. The hunter overtakes him, but, because he has saved his life as a raven, lets him go and rides off again with the princess. When the hunter has disappeared into the wood, the young man creeps back into the house and persuades the princess to wheedle from the hunter the secret of how he obtains his clever white horse. This she successfully does in the night, and the young man, who has hidden himself under the bed, learns about an hour's journey from the hunting lodge there dwells a witch who breeds magic horses. Whoever was able to guard the foals for 3 days might choose a horse as a reward. In former times, said the hunter, she used to make a gift of 12 lambs into the bargain, in order to satisfy the hunger of the 12 wolves who lived in the woods near the farmstead and prevent them from attacking. But to him she gave no lambs. So the wolves followed him after as he rode away, and while crossing the borders of her domain, they succeeded in tearing off one of the horse's hooves. That was why he had only 3 legs. Then the young man made haste to seek out the witch, and agreed to serve on her condition that she give him not only a horse of his own choosing, but 12 lambs as well. To this she consented. Instantly she commanded the foals to run away, and to make him sleepy she gave him brandy. He drinks, falls asleep, and the foals escape. On the first day he catches them with the help of the wolf. On the second day the bear helps him, and on the third the lion. He can now go and choose his reward. The witch's little daughter tells him which horse her mother rides. This is naturally the best horse, and it is all white. Hardly has he got it out of the stall when the witch pierces the 4 hooves and sucks the marrow out of the bones. From this she bakes a cake and gives it to the young man for his journey. The horse grows deathly weak, but the young man feeds it the cake, whereupon the horse recovers its former strength. He gets out of the wood unscathed after quieting the 12 wolves with the 12 lambs. He then fetches the princess and rides away with her. But the 3-legged horse calls out to the hunter, who sets off in pursuit and quickly catches up with him, because the 4-legged horse refuses to gallop. As the hunter approaches, the 4-legged horse cries out to the 3-legged, "Sister, throw him off!" The magician is thrown and trampled to pieces by the 2 horses. The young man sets the princess on the 3-legged horse, and the pair of them ride away to her father's kingdom, where they get married. The 4-legged horse begs him to cut off both their heads, for otherwise they would bring disaster upon him. This he does, and the horses are transformed into a handsome prince and a wonderfully beautiful princess, and after a while they repair to their own kingdom. They had been changed into horses by the hunter long ago. Apart from the theomorphic spirit symbolism in this tale, it is especially interesting to note that the function of knowing and intuition is represented by a riding animal. This is as much as to say the spirit can be somebody's property. The 3-legged white horse is thus the property of the demonic hunter, and the 4-legged one is the property of the witch. Spirit is here partly a function which, like any other object, horse, can change its owner, and partly an autonomous subject, magician as owner of the horse. By obtaining the 4-legged horse from the witch, the young man frees a spirit or a thought of some special kind from the grip of the unconscious. Here as elsewhere, the witch stands for the mater natura, or the original matriarchal state of the unconscious, indicating a psychic constitution in which the unconscious is opposed only by a feeble and still dependent consciousness. The 4-legged horse shows itself superior to the 3-legged, since it can command the latter. And since the quaternity is a symbol of wholesomeness and wholeness, and plays a considerable role in the picture world of the unconscious. The victory of the four-leggedness over the three-leggedness is not altogether unexpected. But what is the meaning of the opposition between threeness and fourness, or rather, what does threeness mean as compared to wholeness? In alchemy, this problem is known as the axiom of Maria, and runs all through alchemical philosophy for more than 1,000 years, finally to be taken up again in the Calabrivi scene in Faust. The earliest literary version of it can be found in the opening words of Plato's Timaeus, of which Goethe gives us a reminder. Among the alchemists we can see clearly how the divine trinity has its counterpart in the lower chthonic triad, similar to Dante's three-headed devil. This represents a principle which, by reason of its symbolism, betrays affinities with evil, though it is by no means certain that it expresses nothing but evil. Everything points rather to the fact that evil, or its familiar symbolism, belongs to the family of figures which describe the dark, nocturnal, lower, chthonic element. In this symbolism, the lower stands to the higher as a correspondence in reverse. That is to say, it is conceived, like the upper, as a triad. 3, being a masculine number, is logically correlated with the wicked hunter, who can be thought of alchemically as the lower triad. 4, a feminine number, is assigned to the old woman. The 2 horses are miraculous animals that talk and know, and thus represent the unconscious spirit, which in one case is subordinated to the wicked magician and in the other to the old witch. Between the 3 and the 4 there exists the primary opposition of male and female, but whereas fourness is a symbol of wholeness, threeness is not. The latter, according to the alchemy, denotes polarity, since one triad always presupposes another, just as high presupposes low, lightness, darkness, good and evil. In terms of energy, polarity means a potential, and whenever a potential exists, there is the possibility of a current, a flow of events, for the tension of opposites strives for balance. If one imagines the quaternity as a square divided into 2 halves by a diagonal, one gets 2 triangles, whose apexes point in opposite directions. One could therefore say metaphorically that if the wholeness symbolized by the quaternity is divided into equal halves, it produces 2 opposing triads. This simple reflection shows how 3 can be derived from 4, and in the same way the hunter of the captured princess explains how his horse, from being 4-legged, became 3-legged, though having one hoof torn off by 12 wolves. The 3-leggedness is due to an accident, therefore, which occurred at the very moment when the horse was leaving the territory of the Dark Mother. In psychological language, we should say that when the unconscious wholeness becomes manifest, i.e., leaves unconscious and crosses into the sphere of consciousness, one of the 4 remains behind, held fast by the horror vacui of the unconscious. There thus arises a triad, which, as we know, not from the fairy tale but from the history of symbolism, constellates a corresponding triad in opposition to it. In other words, a conflict ensues. Here too we could ask Socrates, 1, 2, 3, but my dear Timaeus, of those who yesterday were the banqueters and today are the banquet givers, where is the 4th? He has remained in the realm of Dark Mother, caught by the wolfish greed of the unconscious, which is unwilling to let anything escape from its magic circle, save at the cost of sacrifice. The hunter, or old magician, and the witch correspond to the negative parental images in the magic world of the unconscious. The hunter first appears in the story as a black raven. He has stolen away the princess and holds her a prisoner. She describes him as the devil, but it is exceedingly odd that he himself is locked up in the one forbidden room of the castle and fixed to the wall with 3 nails, as though crucified. He is imprisoned, like all jailers, in his own prison, and bound like all who curse. The prison is of both is a magic castle at the top of a gigantic tree, presumably the world tree. The princess belongs to the upper region of light near the sun. Sitting there in captivity on the world tree, she is a kind of anima mundi, who has got herself into the power of darkness. But this catch does not seem to have done the latter much good either, seeing that the captor is crucified, and moreover with 3 nails. The crucifixion evidently bestokes a state of agonizing bondage and suspension, fit punishment for one foolhardily enough to venture, like a Prometheus, into the orbit of the opposing principle. This was what the raven, who is identified with the hunter, did when he ravished a precious soul from the upper world of light, and so, as punishment, he is nailed to the wall in that upper world. That this is an inverted reflection of the primordial Christian image should be obvious enough. The Savior who freed the soul of humanity from the dominion of the prince of this world was nailed to a cross down below on earth, just as the thieving raven is nailed to the wall in the celestial branches of the world tree for his presumptuous meddling. In our fairy tale, the peculiar interest of the magic spell is the triad of nails. Who it was that made the raven captive is not told in the tale, but it sounds as if a spell has been laid upon him in a triune name. Having climbed up the world tree and penetrated into the magic castle where he is to rescue the princess, our young hero is permitted to enter all the rooms but one, the very room in which the raven is imprisoned. Just as in paradise there was one tree of which it was forbidden to eat, so here there is one room that is not to be opened, with the natural result that it is entered into at once. Nothing excites our interests more than a prohibition. It is the surest way of provoking disobedience. Obviously, there is some secret scheme afoot to free not so much the princess as the raven. As soon as the hero catches sight of him, the raven begins to cry piteously and to complain of thirst, and the young man, moved by the virtue of compassion, slakes it, not with hyssop and gall, but with a quickening water, whereupon the 3 nails fall out, and the raven escapes through the open window. Thus the evil spirit regains his freedom, changing into the hunter, steals the princess for the second time, but this time locks her into a hunting lodge on earth. The second scheme is partially unveiled. The princess must be brought down from the upper world to the world of men, which was evidently not possible without the help of the evil spirit and the man's disobedience. But since in the human world, too, the hunter of souls is the princess's master, the hero has to intervene anew, to which end, as we have seen, he filches the 4-legged horse from the witch and breaks the 3-legged spell of the magician. It was the triad that first transfixed the raven, and the triad also represents the power of the evil spirit. These are the 2 triads that point in opposite directions. Turning now to quite another field, the realm of psychological experience, we know that 3 of the 4 functions of consciousness can become differentiated, i.e., consciousness, while the other remains connected with the matrix, the unconscious, and what is known as the inferior function. It is the Achilles heel of even the most heroic consciousness. Somewhere the strong man is weak, the clever man foolish, the good man bad, and the reverse is also true. In our fairy tale, the triad appears as a mutilated quaternity. If only one leg could be added to the other 3, it would make a whole. The enigmatic axiom of Maria rules. From the third comes the one as the fourth. Ek to tripo to en tata rotov, which presumably means, when the third produces the fourth, it at once produces unity. The lost component, which is in the possession of the wolves belonging to the Great Mother, is indeed only a quarter, but together with the 3, it makes a whole, which does away with the division and conflict. But how is it that a quarter, on the evidence of symbolism, is at the same time a triad? Here the symbolism of our fairy tale leaves us in the lurch, and we are obliged to have some recourse to the facts of psychology. I have said previously that three functions can become differentiated, and only one remains under the spell of the unconscious. This statement must be defined more closely. It is an empirical fact that only one function becomes more or less successfully differentiated, which on that account is known as the superior or main function, and together with extroversion or introversion constitutes the type of conscious attitude. This function has associated with it one or two particularly differentiated auxiliary functions which hardly ever attain the same degree of differentiation as the main function, that is, the same degree of applicability by the will. Accordingly, they possess a higher degree of spontaneity than the main function, which displays a large measure of reliability and is amenable to our intentions. The fourth inferior function proves, on the one hand, to be inaccessible to our will. It appears now as a teasing and distracting imp, now as a deus ex machina, but it always comes and goes of its own volition. From this it is clear that even the differentiated functions have only partially freed themselves from the unconscious. For the rest, they are still rooted in it, and to that extent they operate under its rule. Hence the three differentiated functions at the disposal of the ego have three corresponding unconscious components that have not yet been broken loose from the unconscious. And just as the three conscious and differentiated parts of these functions are not confronted by a fourth, undifferentiated function which acts as a painfully disturbing factor, so also the superior function seems to have its worst enemy in the unconscious. Nor should we omit to mention one final turn of the screw. Like the devil, who delights in disguising himself as an angel of light, the inferior function secretly and mischievously influences the superior function most of all, just as the latter represses the former most strongly. These unfortunately somewhat abstract formulations are necessary in order to throw some light on the tricky and elusive association in our save the mark, childishly simple fairy tale. The two antithetical triads, the one banning and the other representing the power of evil, tally up to a hair's breadth with the functional structure of the conscious and unconscious psyche. Being a spontaneous, naive, and uncontrived product of the psyche, the fairy tale cannot very well express anything except that which the psyche actually is. It is not only our fairy tale that depicts these structural psychic relations, but countless other fairy tales do the same. Our fairy tale reveals with unusual clarity the essentially antithetical nature of the spirit archetype, while on the other hand it shows the bewildering play of antinomies, all aiming at the great goal of higher consciousness. The young swineherd who climbs from the animal level up to the top of the giant world tree, and there, in the upper world of light, discovers his captive anima, his high-born princess, symbolizes the ascent of consciousness, rising from almost bestial regions to a lofty perch, with a broad overlook, which is a singularly appropriate image for an enlargement of the conscious horizon. Once the masculine consciousness has attained this height, it comes face to face with its feminine counterpart, the anima. She is a personification of the unconscious. The meaning shows how inept it is to designate the latter as subconscious. It is not merely below conscious, but it is also above it, so far above it, indeed, that the hero has to climb up to it with considerable effort. This upper conscious, however, is far from being a superconscious in the sense that anyone who reaches it, like our hero, would stand as high above the subconscious as above the earth's surface. On the contrary, he makes a disagreeable discovery that his high and mighty anima, the princess soul, is bewitched up there and no freer than a bird in a golden cage. He must pat himself on the back for having soared up from the flat lands and from almost bestial stupidity, but his soul is in the power of an evil spirit, a sinister father imago, of subterranean nature in the guise of a raven, the celebrated theomorphic figure of the devil. What use now in his lofty perch and his wide horizon, when his own dear soul is languishing in prison? Worse, she plays the game of the underworld and ostensibly tries to stop the young man from discovering the secret of her imprisonment by forbidding him to enter the one room. But secretly she leads him to it by the very fact of her veto. It is as though the unconscious has two hands, of which one always does the opposite of the other. The princess wants and does not want to be rescued, but the evil spirit too has got himself into a fix by all accounts. He wanted to filch a fine soul from the shining upper world, which he could easily do as a winged being, but had not bargained on being shut up there himself. Black spirit though he is, he longs for the light. That is his secret justification, just as being spellbound is a punishment for his transgression. But so long as the evil spirit is caught in the upper world, the princess cannot get down to earth either, and the hero remains lost in paradise. So now he commits the sin of disobedience, and thereby enables the robber to escape, thus causing the abduction of the princess for the second time, a whole chain of calamities. In the result, however, the princess comes down to earth, and the devilish raven assumes the human shape of a hunter. The otherworldly anima and the evil principle both descend to the human sphere, they dwindle to human proportions and thus become approachable. The three-legged, all-knowing horse represents the hunter's own power. It corresponds to the unconscious component of the differentiated functions. The hunter himself personifies the inferior function, which also manifests itself as the hero in his inquisitiveness and love of adventure. As the story unfolds, he becomes more and more like a hunter, and he too obtains his horse from the witch. But unlike him, the hunter omits to obtain the 12 the hunter omitted to obtain the 12 lambs in order to feed the wolves, who then injured his horse. He forgot to pay tribute to the chthonic power because he was nothing but a robber. Through his omission, the hero learns that the unconscious lets its creatures go only at the cost of a sacrifice. The number 12 is presumably a time symbol, and the subsidy meaning of the 12 labors, athla, that have to be performed for the unconscious before one can get free. The hunter looks like a previous unsuccessful attempt of the hero to gain possession of his soul through robbery and violence. But the conquest of the soul is in reality a work of patience, self-sacrifice, and devotion. By gaining possession of the four-legged horse, the hero steps right into the shoes of the hunter and carries off the princess as well. The quaternity of our tale proves to be the greater power, and for it integrates into its totality that which is still needed in order to become whole. The archetype of the spirit in this, be it said, by no means primitive fairy tale, is expressed theomorphically as a system of three functions which is subordained into a unity, the evil spirit, in the same way that some unnamed authority has crucified the raven with a triad of 3 nails. The two supraordinate unities correspond in the first case to the inferior function, which is the arch enemy of the main function, namely to the hunter, and in the second case to the main function, namely to the hero. Hunter and hero are ultimately equated with one another, so that the hunter's function is resolved in the hero. As a matter of fact, the hero lies dormant in the hunter from the very beginning, egging him on with all the unmoral means at his disposal to carry out the rape of the soul, then causing him to play her into the hero's hands against the hunter's will. On the first surface, a furious conflict rages between them, but down below, the one goes about the other's business. The knot is unraveled directly, and the hero succeeds in capturing the quaternity, or in psychological language, he assimilates the inferior function into the ternary system. That puts an end to the conflict at one blow, and the figure of the hunter melts into thin air. After this victory, the hero sets his princess upon his three-legged steed, and together they ride away to her father's kingdom. From now on she rules and personifies the realm of spirit that formerly served the wicked hunter. Thus the anima is and remains the representative of that part of the unconscious which can never be assimilated into a humanly attainable whole. Postscript. Only after the completion of my manuscript was my attention drawn by a friend to a Russian variant of our story. It bears the title Maria Morvina. The hero of the story is no swineherd, but a Czechvichian Ivan. There an interesting explanation of the three helpful animals. They correspond to Ivan's three sisters and their husbands, who are really birds. The three sisters represent an unconscious triad of functions related to both the animal and spiritual realms. The birdmen are species of angel and emphasize the auxiliary nature of the unconscious functions. In the story, they intervene at the crucial moment when the hero, unlike his German counterpart, gets into the power of the evil spirit and is killed and dismembered, a typical fate of the godmen. The evil spirit is an old man who is often shown naked and is called Kostchi. The man who is often shown the deathless, Kostchi the deathless. The corresponding witch is the well-known Baba Yaga. The three helpful animals of the German variant are doubled here, appearing first as the birdmen, then as the lion, the strange bird, and the bees. The princess is Queen Maria Morvina, a redoubtable martial leader. Mary, the Queen of Heaven, is lauded in the Russian Orthodox hymnal as leader of hosts, who has chained up the evil spirits with 12 chains in the forbidden rooms in her castle. When Ivan slakes the old devil's thirsts, he makes off with the queen. The magic writing animals do not in the end turn into human beings. This Russian story has a distinctly more primitive character. 5. Supplement. The following remarks lay no claim to general interest, being in the main technical. I wanted to first delete them from this revised version of my essay, but I then changed my mind and appended them in supplement. The reader who is not specifically interested in psychology can safely skip this section, for in what follows I have dealt with the obtuse-looking problem of the three- and four-leggedness of the magic courses, and presented my reflections in such a way as to demonstrate the method I have employed. This piece of psychological reasoning rests firstly on the irrational data of the material, that is, the fairy tale, myth, or dream, and secondly on the conscious realization that the latent rational connections with which the data have with another. That such connections exist at all is something of a hypothesis, like that which asserts the dreams have meaning. The truth of this assumption is not established a priori. Its usefulness can only be proven by application. It therefore remains to be seen whether its methodological application to irrational material enables one to interpret the latter in a meaningful way. Its application consists in approaching the material as if it had a coherent inner meaning. For this purpose, most of the data required a certain amplification. That is, they needed to be clarified, generalized, and approximated to a more or less general concept in accordance with Cardan's rule of the interpretation. For instance, the three-leggedness, in order to be recognized for what it is, has first to be separated from the horse and then approximated to its specific principle, the principle of threeness. Likewise, the four-leggedness in the fairy tale, when raised to the level of a general concept, enters into relationship with the threeness, and as a result we have the enigma media mentioned in Timaeus, the problem of 3 and 4. Triads and tetrads represent the archetypal structure that play a significant part in all symbolism and are equally important for the investigation of myths and dreams. By raising the irrational datum, three-leggedness and four-leggedness, to the level of general concept, we elicit the universal meaning of this motif and encourage the inquiring mind to tackle the problem seriously. This task involves a series of reflections and deductions of a technical nature which I would not wish to withhold from the psychologically interested reader, and especially from a professional, the less so as this labor of the intellect represents a typical unraveling of symbols, and is indispensable for the adequate understanding of the products of the unconscious. Only in this way can the nexus of unconscious relationships be made to yield their meeting, in contrast to those deductive interpretations derived from a preconceived theory, i.e., interpretations based on astronomy, meteorology, mythology, and last but not least, the sexual theory. The three-legged and four-legged horses are in truth a recondite matter worthy of closer examination. The 3 and the 4 remind us not only of the dilemma we have already met in the theory of psychological functions, but also of the axiomium of Maria Prophetessa, which plays a considerable role in alchemy. It may therefore be rewarding to examine more closely the meaning of the miraculous horses. The first thing that seems to me worthy of note is that the three-legged horse, which is assigned to the princess as her mount, is a mare, and moreover herself a bewitched princess. Threeness is unmistakably connected here with a femininity, whereas from the dominating religious standpoint of consciousness, it is an exclusively masculine affair, quite apart from the fact that 3, as an uneven number, is masculine in the first place. One could therefore translate threeness as masculinity outright, this being all the more significant when one remembers the ancient Egyptian trinity of God, Ka-Mutanuf, and the pharaoh. Three-leggedness, as the attribute of some animal, denotes the unconscious masculinity immanent in the female creature. In a real woman, it would correspond to the animus who, like the magic horse, represents spirit. In the case of the anima, however, the threeness does not coincide with any Christian idea of Trinity, but with the lower triangle, the inferior function triad that constitutes the shadow. The interior half of the personality is for the greater part unconscious. It does not denote the whole of the unconscious, but only the personal segmentation of it. The anima, on the other hand, so far as she is distinguished from the shadow, personifies the collective unconscious. If threeness is assigned to her as a riding animal, it means that she rides the shadow, is related to as the mar. In that case, she possesses the shadow. But if she herself is the horse, then she has lost her dominating position as a personification of the collective unconscious and is ridden, possessed, by Princess A, spouse of the hero. As the fairy tale rightly says, she has been changed by witchcraft into the three-legged horse, Princess B. We can sort out this imbroglio more or less as follows. 1. Princess A is the anima of the hero. She rides, that is, possesses, the three-legged horse, who is the shadow, the inferior functioning triad of her later spouse. To put it more simply, she has taken possession of the inferior half of the horse's personality. She has caught him on his weak side, as so often happens in ordinary life. For where one is weak, one needs support and completion. In fact, a woman's place is on the weak side of the man. This is how we would have to formulate the situation if we regarded the hero and the Princess A as two ordinary people. But since it is a fairy story played out mainly in the world of magic, we are probably more correct in interpreting Princess A as the hero's anima. In that case, the hero has been wafted out of the profane world through his encounter with the anima, like Merlin by his fairy. As an ordinary man, he is like one caught in a marvelous dream, viewing the world through a veil of mists. 2. The matter is now considerably complicated by the unexpected fact that the three-legged horse is a mare, an equivalent of Princess A. She, the mare, is Princess B, who, in the shape of the horse, corresponds to Princess A's shadow, i.e., her inferior functioned triad. Princess B, however, differs from Princess A in that, unlike her, she does not ride the horse, but is contained in it. She is bewitched and has thus come under the spell of a masculine triad. Therefore, she is possessed by a shadow. 3. The question now is, whose shadow? It cannot be the shadow of the hero, for this is already taken up by the latter's anima. The fairy tale gives us the answer. It is the hunter or the magician who has bewitched her. As we have seen, the hunter is somehow connected with the hero, since the latter gradually puts himself in his shoes. Hence, one can easily arrive at the conjecture that the hunter is at the bottom none other than the shadow of the hero. But this supposition is contradicted by the fact that the hunter stands for a favorable power which extends not only to the hero's anima, but much further, namely to a royal brother-sister pair whose existence the hero and his anima have no notion, and who appear very much out of the blue in the story itself. The power that extends beyond the orbit of the individual has more than individual character and cannot therefore be identified with the shadow, if we conceive and define this as the dark half of the personality. As a super-individual factor, the Newman of the hunter is a dominant of the collective unconscious, and its characteristic features, hunter, magician, raven, miraculous horse, crucifixion, or suspension high up in the boughs of the world tree, touch the Germanic psyche very closely. Hence the Christian Weltanschauung, which reflected in the ocean of the Germanic unconscious, logically takes on the features of Wotan. In the figure of the hunter we meet the imago Dei, the god image, for Wotan is also a god of winds and spirits, on which account the Romans fittingly interpreted him as Mercury. 4. The prince and his sister, Princess B, have therefore been seized by a pagan god and changed into horses, i.e., thrust down to the animal level into the realm of the unconscious. The inference is their proper human shape, that the pair of them once belonged to the sphere of collective consciousness. But who are they? In order to answer this question, we must proceed from the fact that the two are an undoubted counterpart of the hero and Princess A. They are connected with the latter also because they serve as their mounts, and in consequence they appear as their lower animal halves. Because of its almost total unconsciousness, the animal has always symbolized the psychic sphere in man which lies hidden in the darkness of the body's instinctual life. The hero rides the stallion, characterized by the even feminine number 4. Princess A rides the mare, who has only 3 legs. 3 is a masculine number. These numbers make it clear that the transformation into animals has brought with it a modification of sex character. The stallion has a feminine attribute, the mare a masculine one. Psychology can confirm this development as follows. To the degree that a man is overpowered by the collective conscious, there is not only a more unbridled intrusion of the instinctual sphere, but a certain feminine character also makes its appearance, which I have suggested should be called anima. If, on the other hand, a woman comes under the dominion of the unconscious, the darker side of her feminine nature emerges all the more strongly, coupled with markedly masculine traits. These latter are comprised under the term animus. 5. According to the fairy tale, however, the animal form of the brother-sister pair is unreal and due simply to the magic influence of the pagan hunter god. If they were nothing but animals, we could rest content with this interpretation. But that would be to pass over it in unmerited silence, the singular allusion to the modification of sex character. The white horses are no ordinary horses. They are miraculous beasts with supernatural powers. Therefore, the human figures out of which the horses were magically conjured must likewise have something supernatural about them. The fairy tale makes no comment here, but if our assumption is correct, then the two animal forms correspond to the subhuman components of hero and princess. Then it follows that the human forms, Prince and Princess B, must correspond to their superhuman components. The superhuman quality of the original swineherd is shown by the fact that he becomes a hero, practically a half-god, since he does not stay with his swine but climbs the world tree, where he is very nearly made its prisoner, like Wotan. Similarly, he could not have become like the hunter if he did not have a certain resemblance to him in the first place. In the same way, the imprisonment of Princess A on the top of the world tree proves her electness, and insofar as she shares the hunter's bed, as stated by the tale, she is actually the bride of God. It is these extraordinary forces of heroism and election, bordering on the supernatural, which involve two quite ordinary humans in a superhuman fate. Accordingly, in the profane world, a swineherd would become king, and a princess gets an agreeable husband. But since for fairy tales there is not only a profane but also a magical world, human fate does not have the final word. The fairy tale does not omit to point out what happens in the world of magic. There, too, a prince and a princess have got into the power of evil spirit, who is himself in a tight corner from which he cannot extricate himself without help. So the human fate that befalls the swineherd and Princess A is paralleled in the world of magic. But insofar as the hunter is a pagan god image, and thus exalted above the world of heroes and paramounts of the gods, the parallelism goes beyond the merely magical into the divine and spiritual sphere, where the evil spirit, the devil himself, or at least a devil, is bound by the spell of an equally mighty or even mightier counter-principle indicated by the three nails. This supreme tension of opposites, the mainspring of the whole drama, is obviously the conflict between the upper and lower triads, or to put it in theological terms, between the Christian God and the devil, who is assumed in the features of Wotan. 6. We must, it seems, start with the highest level if we want to understand the story correctly, for the drama takes its rise from the initial transgression of the evil spirit. The immediate consequence of this is his crucifixion. In that distressing situation he needs outside help. So as not to be forthcoming from above, it can only be summoned from below. A young swineherd possessed by the boyish spirit of adventure is reckless and inquisitive enough to climb the world tree. Had he fallen and broken his neck, no doubt everybody would have said, "What evil spirit would have given him this crazy idea of climbing up an enormous tree like that?" Nor would they have even been altogether wrong, for that is precisely what the evil spirit was after. The capture of Princess A was a transgression in the profane world, and the bewitching of, as we suppose, semi-divine brother-sister pair was just an enormity in the magical world, was just such an enormity in the magical world. We do not know, but it is possible that this heinous crime was committed before the bewitching of Princess A. At any rate, both episodes point to a transgression of the evil spirit in the magical world as well as the profane. It is assuredly not without deeper meaning that the rescuer or redeemer should be a swineherd, like the prodigal son. He is of lowly origin and has this much in common with the curious conception of the Redeemer in alchemy. His first liberating act is to deliver the evil spirit from the divine punishment meted out to him. It is from this act, representing the first stage of the lysis, that the whole dramatic tangle develops. 7. The moral of this story is the truth exceedingly odd. The finale satisfies in so far as the swineherd and Princess A are married and become the royal pair. Prince and Princess B likewise celebrate their wedding, but this, in accordance with the archaic prerogative of kings, takes the form of incest, which, although somewhat repellent, must be regarded as more or less habitual in semi-divine circles. But what, we may ask, happens to the evil spirits who rescue from condign punishment sets the whole thing in motion? The wicked hunter is trampled to pieces by the horses, which presumably does no lasting damage to a spirit. Apparently he vanishes without a trace, but only apparently, for he does not after all leave a trace behind him, namely a hard-won happiness in both the profane and the magical world. Two halves of the quaternity, represented on one side by the swineherd and Princess A, and on the other by Prince and Princess B, have each come together and united. Two marriage pairs now confront one another, parallel but otherwise divided, insomuch as one pair belongs to the profane and the other to the magical world. But in spite of this indubitable division, secret psychological connections, as we have seen, exist between them, which allow us to derive one pair from the other. Speaking in the spirit of the fairy tale, which unfolds its drama from the highest point, one would have to say that the world of half-gods is anterior to the profane one, and produces it out of itself, just as the world of half-gods must be thought of as producing from the world of gods. Conceived in this way, the swineherd and Princess A are nothing less than the earthy simulacra of Prince and Princess B, who in their turn would be descendants of the divine prototypes. Nor should we forget that the horse-breeding witch belongs to the hunter as his female counterpart, rather like the ancient Epoea as a Celtic goddess of horses. Unfortunately, we are not told how the magical conjecturation into horses happened, But it is evident that the witch had a hand in the game because both the horses were raised from her stock and are thus, in a sense, her productions. Hunter and witch form a pair, the reflection in the nocturnal Carthronic part of the magical world of a divine parental pair. The latter is easily recognized in the central Christian idea of sposus et sposa, Christ and his bride, the Church. If we want to explain the fairy tale personalistically, the attempt would fodder on the fact that the archetypes are not whimsical inventions but autonomous elements of the unconscious psyche which, were there any invention which before any inventions was thought of. They represent the unalterable structure of a psychic world whose reality is attested by the determining effects it has upon the conscious mind. Thus, it is a significant psychic reality that the human pair is matched by another pair in the unconscious, the latter pair being only in appearance a reflection of the first. In reality, the royal pair invariably comes first, as a priori, so that the human pair has far more significance of an individual consecration in space and time of eternal and primordial images, at least in its mental structure, which is imparted upon a biological continuum. We could say, then, that the swineherd stands for the animal man, who had a soulmate somewhere in the upper world, but by her royal birth she betrays her connection with the pre-existent semi-divine pair. Looking at it from this angle, the latter stands for everything a man can become if he only climbs high enough up the world tree. For to the degree that the young swineherd gains possession of the patrician feminine half of himself, he approximates to the pair of half-gods and lifts himself into the sphere of royalty, which means universal validity. We come across the same theme in Christian Rosenkranz's Chemical Wedding, where the king's son must first free his bride from the power of the Moor, to whom she has voluntarily given herself as a concubine. The Moor represents the alchemical negrido, in which the arcane substance lies hidden, an idea that forms yet another parallel in our mythologium, or, as we would say in psychological language, another variant of this archetype. As in alchemy, our fairy tale describes the unconscious process that compensates the conscious Christian situation. It depicts the workings of a spirit who carried our Christian thinking beyond the boundaries set out by ecclesiastical concepts, seeking an answer to questions which neither the Middle Ages nor the present day have been able to solve. It is not difficult to see in the image of the second royal pair a correspondence to the ecclesiastical conception of bridegroom and bride, and in the hunter and witch a distortion of it, veering towards an atavistic unconscious Wotanism. The fact that it is a German fairy tale makes the position particularly interesting, since the same Wotanism is the psychological godfather of National Socialism, a phenomenon which carried the distortion to the lowest pitch before the eyes of the world. On the other hand, the fairy tale makes it clear that it is possible for a man to attain totality, to become whole, only with the cooperation of the spirit of darkness. Indeed, that the latter is actually a causa instructamentalis of redemption and individuation. Another perversion of this goal of spiritual development, to which all nature aspires and which is prefigured in Christian doctrine, National Socialism destroyed man's moral autonomy and sets up the nonsensical totalitarian of the state. The fairy tale tells us how to proceed if we want to overcome the power of darkness. We must turn his own weapons against him, which naturally cannot be done if the magical underworld of the hunter remains unconscious, and if the best man in the nation would rather preach dogmatisms and platitudes than take the human psyche seriously. 6. Conclusion. When we consider the spirit in its archetypal form as it appears to us in fairy tales and dreams, it presents a picture that differs strangely from the conscious idea of spirit, which is split up in so many meanings. Spirit was originally a spirit in human or animal form, a daimonion that came upon men from without, but our material already shows traces of an expansion of consciousness, which has gradually begun to occupy that originally unconscious territory and to transform the daimonia, at least partially, into voluntary acts. Man conquers not only nature but spirit also without realizing what he is doing. To the man of enlightened intellect it seems like a correction of a fallacy when he recognizes that that what he took to be spirits is simply the human spirit and ultimately his own spirit. All the superhuman things, whether good or bad, that former ages predicted as daimonia are reduced to reasonable proportions as though they were pure exaggeration, and everything seems to be in the best possible order. But were the unanimous convictions of the past really and truly only exaggerations? If they were not, then the integration of the spirit means nothing less than its demonization, since the superhuman spiritual agencies that were formerly tied up in nature are interjected into human nature, thus endowing it with a power which extends the bounds of the personality ad infinitum in the most perilous way. I put it to the enlightened rationalist, for has her rational reduction led to the beneficial control of matter and spirit? She will point proudly to the advances in physics and medicine, to the freeing of the mind from medieval stupidity, and, as a well-meaning Christian, to our deliverance from the fear of demons. But we continue to ask, what has all our other cultural achievements led to? The fearful answer is there before our eyes. Man has been delivered from no fear. A hideous nightmare lies upon the world. So far reason has failed lamentably, and the very thing that everybody wanted to avoid rolls on in ghastly progression. Man has achieved a wealth of useful gadgets, but, to offset that, she has torn open the abyss, and what will become of her now, and where can she make a halt? After the last World War we hoped for reason. We go on hoping. But already we are fascinated by the possibilities of atomic fission, and promise ourselves a golden age, the surest guarantee that the abomination of dissolution will grow to limitless dimensions. And who or what is its cause who or what is it that causes all this? It is none other than that harmless, ingenious, inventive, and sweetly reasonable human spirit, who unfortunately is abysmally unconscious of the daemonism that still clings to her. Worse, this spirit does everything to avoid looking herself in the face, and we will all help her like mad. Only heaven preserves us from psychology, that depravity might lead to self-knowledge. Rather, let us have wars for which somebody else is always to blame, nobody seeing that all the world is driven to do just what all the world flees from in terror. It seems to me, frankly, that former ages did not exaggerate, that the spirit has not sloughed off its demonisms, and that mankind, because of its scientific and technological development, has in increasing measure delivered itself over to the dangers of possession. True, the archetype of the spirit is capable of working for good as well as for evil, but it depends on man's free, i.e. conscious decision, whether the good will also be perverted into something satanic. Man's worst sin is unconsciousness, for it is indulged in with the greatest piety, even by those who would serve mankind as teachers and examples. When shall we stop taking men for granted in this barbarous manner, and in all seriousness seek ways and means to exorcise him, to rescue him from possession and consciousness, and make this most vital task of civilization? Can we not understand that all the outward tinkerings and improvements do not touch man's inner nature, and that everything ultimately depends on whether the man who wields the science and the techniques is capable of responsibility or not? Christianity has shown us the way, but, as facts bear to witness, it has not penetrated deeply enough below the surface. What depths of despair are still needed to open the eyes of the world's responsible leaders, so that at least they can refrain from leading themselves into temptation?